Well, Troy, I am super glad to be here. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity. I've been looking forward to it. I've been putting a lot of thought and effort into it, and I'm looking forward to sharing a few thoughts that I'm hopeful for and believe will be of value to the work that that all of you up there are doing. That is so valuable. Obviously, in the U.S., we're experiencing a little bit of election hangover. So if I get disconnected or a voting recount alert comes on, you may know why we get disrupted here. But other than that, I think we're good to go. It's definitely been an interesting few days, but in some ways, maybe perhaps a perfect backdrop for some of the things that I want to share with you and talk to you about today. So let me start off with this. 1969 was a pretty interesting year in the U.S. A lot was going on. First of all, we put a man on the moon, which was a huge accomplishment. Obviously, there was a major space race going on, and it really climaxed in 1969 with the one small step comment. We reached peak levels in the U.S. of troops in Vietnam. And we had about 500,000, so 500,000 troops there fighting in that war. And then back at home, 69 was kind of a culmination with Woodstock of this massive cultural revolution that had been taking place that was shifting cultural norms and attitudes. And that iconic concert really defined a decade. I mean, these are, I think, some of the three key images, and it all happened within 1 year. With all the stuff going on in that particular year, it was really easy to miss the beginning of an idea that began to take root in 1969 as well. After World War II, a group of doctors began to do some studies and noticed that there were issues with smoking. And after nearly 2 decades of researching this, they were able and successfully able to get the Surgeon General to mandate what is famous, most people who smoke, or even those who don't, are used to the Surgeon General's warning. And in 1969, they were able, through this research and work that they had done, to begin, as a first step, mandating this label, but then what would become a multi-decade-long effort to reduce smoking, particularly amongst teens. So this new anti-smoking movement focused on 3 key tools to try to drive home this diffusion of this idea, this social change that they were hoping to have happen. So number one, they really focused a lot on the data, looking what were the impacts, the cigarettes, what were they doing, what was the medical data, and then taking that medical data and in many ways creating a, fear type ad campaign, right? That we would focus on that. You'd see the lungs, you'd see different things happening. And so they would work on that. And then they further continued to work through government advocacy. They continued to work on the policy front. So what was the result of this multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar campaign as it relates to social change or what was happening in the United States? So here's what initially happened. So the first while, there was a small decrease, ultimately resulting in about got the numbers here. After 30 years, the rate finally had dropped from 40% of teens doing it to 20. So they cut the rate in half. So it looked fairly successful. They were winning the war on the use of cigarettes because of what it was doing to teens and setting them up for addiction later on in life, or to be addicted just to cigarettes, not other things as well. So it looked like we were winning. Big tobacco, there were the lawsuits and other things. We were winning that war. Well, then e-cigarettes came along. And what happened? We're right back trending to where we were back in 1997. So all of that money, all of those efforts, all of those gains wiped out. So, here's some of the campaigns. We saw this, right? These were, just a few of the campaigns that were used in terms of publicity in conjunction with the policy and others. And yet, this is what we saw. So we really didn't create a sustained change in behavior. Why? And that's one of the questions I want to focus on today. For many decades now, in the freedom movement, we've been fighting our own anti-smoking campaign. But our campaign isn't obviously to stop smoking or change behavior there necessarily. Ours has been to combat ideas like communism, populism, socialism, and a whole host of other isms that we believe destroy freedom, inhibit human progress, and have zero respect, really, at the end of the day, for human dignity and the individual. Much like the anti-smoking campaign, I think we followed in some similar steps. We've been really good at the data. We've got, whether it's, here's a great piece of information for those of you, and for the folks there in Canada, probably this as well as anyone, the wait times and what happens in a healthcare socialist system in terms of wait times for receiving the healthcare that you might need. So we've got the data, and we use that data, and we have used white papers, and we've got this going. We've also used fear. There have been some pretty stark images, whether it's the empty shelves in Venezuela, the protests in Hong Kong, or perhaps one of the most iconic moments of courage in the face of tyranny, Tiananmen Square. And here, again, the fear is, if you want socialism, you want these ideas in the U.S., welcome to your new reality. This is what you're asking for. This is the kind of tyranny that you will get. And then we've also done our own level of advocacy. We've created our own Surgeon General's warning. I think those negative health benefits are quite well documented. So we have worked at a level, and I know maybe perhaps more so in the US than in Canada, but we've actually worked to change the law, to change the public policy environment. And what have we gotten for the decades of work here? The millions and millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent globally, perhaps even $1 billion now. I haven't done the actual research, but I think we're probably, if not at that point, we're getting close to it. Where are we? How are we doing? Well, for decades, obviously there was the Cold War, but in 1989, it felt like we maybe hit a pinnacle point where we won. That the ideas of freedom, the ideas of democracy, of liberalism, really, again, another iconic image. It was interesting. I was in Berlin 1 year after the wall fell. It was a profound moment for me. There was still quite a bit of the wall that was up. Obviously, a lot of it had been knocked down. And there was still a fairly significant difference between the east side and the west side. You could see that. For me as a teenager, it was stark. It was very real. I could see that image burned in. And it looked like, as I said, that freedom was winning. Fast forward now from 1989 to 2020. And here we are. Populism around the globe is on the rise. We've got Venezuela that in the midst of all this, people refer to. You've got Bernie Sanders. You've got groups in the U.S. that there has been this resurgence of these ideas, and they've given them different names, right? It's the same product. It's essentially the same process, but it's got newfangled names like democratic socialism as opposed to socialism. Still don't know what the difference is there, but the branding sounds a lot better. And in some ways, we're moving back to where we started before 1989, where people somehow are glomming onto, and in the US in particular, larger and larger amounts of young people seem to think that socialism would be a great way to go. So in the midst of all this, what do we do? What's going on? Why has this happened? And this question of how do ideas spread or stop spreading or slow down has been one that has been of key interest to me. And part of that has been born out of loss. I'm going to share a story here in a little bit about that. But in that search for an answer to that question, I came across a theory doing my doctoral work. And the theory is the diffusion of innovation. It intrigued me so much, and it felt like it had so many answers to the questions I had about this idea of why doesn't social change happen more, or why haven't we been more successful in the freedom movement, that I really honed on this, and this became the core theory around which I did my dissertation work. I wanted to find some answers that I felt like would help us be more successful. So the theory essentially states this: there's a pattern. There's a pattern in which ideas, concepts, products, policies follow in terms of their adoption. And if we can better understand that process, we can perhaps better engage in that process to be more successful in getting more of our ideas up the curve, over the top, and into mass adoption. So first in this curve, there are 5 different kinds of adopters. The first group is innovators. As you can see up here on the screen, that's about 2.5% of any group are these innovators. They're the first ones to adopt. So don't confuse innovator with innovation. So the innovation, they're not the ones necessarily creating the innovation, but they're the first ones to say, hey, this is a great idea, we want to. You have this next group of early adopters, about 13.5%. And then we hit this thing called the chasm. So by and large, it's actually pretty easy to get to, 2.5% plus 13% to get to 16%. That first 16% is not too challenging. But once we get to that point, there is this gap where most innovative ideas, policies, concepts, social movements go to die. And why is that? And we're going to spend some more time really focusing on how do we get over the chasm today. And that's the lessons that I'll share here in a bit. And then you've got this early majority who, by and large, they are perhaps sympathetic, maybe more easily persuaded, but it's still going to take some work to get them on board. The late majority, they're probably not philosophically aligned with where you are. They're going to take more persuading. Maybe they've been burned by an idea in the past. And then you have this group of laggards, the 16% at the very end. These are the folks that if they had a rotary phone, they'd still be using that instead of a cell phone. So they really have to be drug along with the change. And that 16%, if you look at it, 16 versus 16, part of that chasm is once that 16% sees you being successful, getting up to a 16%, they kick into high gear and begin to actively work to undo the change that you're doing. So again, part of that that trigger happens with that chasm, one of the things contributing to that. So there are lots of reasons why, and I'll get into that, but the theory again basically states I have to go through each of these groups. If I stop somewhere, especially if I don't get over that hump onto the other side, that idea will not take hold and will move back the other way, will be rejected, or another idea will come forward. So let me tell you a little story in terms of how this really came to, how I really saw this happen, and one of the reasons why I have spent so much time in both my dissertation work, consulting work, and now in my work at Atlas Network. In 2007, I was in the state of Utah, a very red state, a Republican, heavily Republican state. In fact, in the gubernatorial election, the Republican governor won the race. I believe it was around 73% of the vote that year, in a couple years before that. And one of the things he had run on is that he was going to help pass vouchers. So in 2004, that was part of his platform. And it took a few years to get it through, but eventually they were going to work for, and the national folks thought, hey, we're going to get a big voucher. Utah's the place to do it. Look at that huge Republican majority. Republicans are for choice. They're for freedom. They're for, they don't like big bureaucracy and big government programs, which a lot of public education is. It's a government program. So they thought they could win in Utah. So again, governors elected 2005. They began working on it. Didn't get it passed in 2006. Didn't get it passed, but they won some critical elections to give them some more Republican seats in the House. And so they came back in 2007. We won. We got a universal voucher passed in the state of Utah. No sooner had the governor, per his promise, he had signed it into law. No sooner had he signed it, Then the teachers union came out and said, we are going to run a referendum on this bill. Within about 3 weeks, they had gathered all the signatures they needed to get it on the ballot. And that following November, we lost almost 65 to 35. Voters in Utah rejected this voucher program. What does that mean? It means, if I look at the numbers, that a significant portion of those conservative, those Republican, freedom-loving, small government Republicans said, no, thank you. And the idea died. In fact, the concept of vouchers, because of what had happened at that point, disappeared for 13 years. It's just starting to come back. And even with that, there's some trepidation in the state. They don't really want to touch it, but maybe there's a little bit of appetite. So I was on the front lines of this. I was working at a think tank. We were advocating for this. We were putting out, papers about this. We were on the radio about this. I wrote an article for National Review about this. We were doing everything we could to convince Utahns that this was the freedom way to go, that Utah schools would be better, kids would be better, etc. And yet we lost. And not only did we lose, we lost big. And so why did we lose? What happened? The answer to that are in these 5 lessons. So let's get into that. So the 5 lessons of diffusion or social change. Diffusion is just a theory, but it's really a theory that digs into how does change happen, particularly social change. And so here are the 5 lessons based on research and my own experience as I go back and now and evaluate not just the voucher campaign, but others that we're seeing, like today, the re-rise or the gaining traction of socialism and others around the world. What does that look like? So lesson number 1, different audiences equals a different message. We cannot talk to every group the exact same way. To a certain extent, that makes sense. We get that. But frankly, from what my experience has been, we're not very good at that. We're not very good at targeting and saying, for this group of folks, we're going to speak to them this way. And for another set of individuals, we're going to talk to them in another way. So again, going back to that diffusion curve, the innovators, they love data, they love the intellectual argument, and by and large, they're super aligned with you philosophically. So getting them on board, really all I need to say is, I've got a great idea, and they're like, tell me more, I'm on board. When I get to those early adopters, that doesn't quite work as well. As you move through that curve, connecting with the heart as well as the mind becomes increasingly important. And not only that, I have to start using different kinds of words. So let me give you an example of that. We had a partner in India that did a large report on economic freedom, CCS, an amazing partner in India. They issued this report talking about economic freedom and what it would mean for the average Indian. And their hope was that by putting out this report and doing a lot of public relations and media relations and kind of roadshow with it and social media support, they would get people on board for what they were doing. The report fell flat. Well, why? When they dug a little deeper, what they found was, for that early majority, late majority, etc., economic freedom didn't mean anything to them. It was a great word for me in the movement. I get it. I know what economic freedom means and why it's valuable. But for the average Indian, they saw Tony Stark. Economic freedom is for rich people. It's not for me. So it simply did not connect with them. And as a result, they rejected it. So CCS, recognizing this, made a shift. And this is what they shifted to. Rather than referring to economic freedom, they began to talk in terms of livelihood freedom. Indians are highly entrepreneurial. I've been there. It's an amazing place. I don't know quite how to describe it when you go and when you think of slums, maybe in the U.S. or Harlem or some of these places, the inner cities, it is totally different than the slums in India. Obviously there is poverty, but there is a small business person on every corner. They're selling fruits, vegetables, a stereo, water bottles, you name it. The entrepreneurship level in many of these developing countries is incredible. There's an incredible energy there. They want to work. And so connecting with that desire, the dignity that comes with the job of livelihood, turned the tables for CCS. And in simply switching the terms slightly to talk to a broader group, it connected with that broader group, and many of the reforms now, some of these we've even documented on our DignityUnbound.com effort. And on Atlas Network, you can read about the Bamboo Entrepreneur as one of those, where we've been able to see some significant process in allowing people to have greater livelihood freedom in India. But it started with changing the way we talked about our ideas. I tell people all the time, one of the phrases I hate most in our movement, I understand it, I get it, but I think it is a terrible phrase for those that we need to get on board and bring into our movement, and that's taxation is theft. Again, intellectually, philosophically, I understand it. It does not resonate. In fact, FEE did a study where they took a variety of terms. They took that phrase, taxation is theft. Only 5%, I think it was 5 to 10% of the people that they surveyed resonated with that. The rest of them didn't like it. So we're alienating by using terms that don't connect a key piece of our audience if we really want to engage and move them across the spectrum. So, lesson number 2. Not all innovations and ideas are the same. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, ideas, innovations, products, technologies, policy ideas come in different forms in terms of how disruptive or how much change do they actually create. And so as we think about a policy or a change that we may want to be pursuing, whether that's a property rights issue, whether that's a right to life, whether that's, you name it, we need to take stock of and evaluate, what am I really asking the marketplace to adopt or change to? And how different is it from where they are today? So there are really 4 ways to think about a policy idea or a social change. Is it incremental? Is it modular? Is it architectural? Or is it radical? So let me give an example of a ceiling fan to maybe help illustrate what I'm talking about in terms of, or to give a bit of perspective of what I mean by these types of innovations and the differences between them. So let's take a ceiling fan. With a ceiling fan, there are multiple parts and pieces. From an incremental standpoint, one of the ways that might be incremental change is I look at the blades, right? Bigger, smaller, wood, plastic. I really don't change much of anything about the wiring, how it's constructed, built, packaged, sold, nothing like that, right? I'm just changing out a part that really doesn't have really any impact other than maybe it looks better, maybe it moves a little bit more air, maybe it lasts a little bit longer. So there's incremental progress or benefit, and there's really not much as a consumer of the idea or product. I don't really have to make much change to adopt that. So it's easy for me to move that direction. Now, if I look at modular would be adding a light fixture to that ceiling fan. That's different, right? The light bulb is different. There's a different aspect in terms of the switch. Do I have to, switch both on at one time? I need actually to change the wiring and circuitry actually within the system itself, because I maybe don't want them running on the same thing. So there is some difference in what's going on, and I may not necessarily want the light in my room, right? That may not be the reason why I have the fan. The fan in the first place is to move air around, not necessarily to provide light. So I've changed to a larger extent the function of what that fan does. Now, not only does it produce light or produce air movement, it produces light. Architectural would be, I take the fan out of the ceiling. I can move it around anywhere in that room. I have to put some things around the blade, right? I have to create actually an entirely different way in which the fan shows up, the power sourcing, etc. The final one, again, in the radical side, is central air, which totally displaces. I don't need the fan anymore. It's a whole new product, but it's more expensive to set up initially, right? If I want to put it in a home where I don't necessarily have, the ducting built in, it's expensive to do that and requires a lot of change. But if I put it in, I don't need those fans anymore. And it's totally disrupting the market. If I go back to the Utah example, I think one of the mistakes that we made in Utah with vouchers is we treated vouchers like ceiling fan blades when it was actually the ceiling fan that was off, totally disconnected from the ceiling, different power structure, totally mobile, could move it all the way around, didn't need to be housed in one particular room. I could move it to any room I wanted it to. We really underestimated how disruptive and how much change needed to occur. It wasn't what I would consider radical, because kids were still going to go to a classroom. You still needed teachers, probably you still needed buses. So a lot of the system was going to change, or was not going to change in terms of actual instruction, but it was significant enough, and we underestimated this, that voters said, wait, that's too much change for us. I'm not really comfortable with what that would look like. And as a result, because we underestimated it, we sold it as incremental, and it was far more radical than that. The voters rejected it. So that was one of the mistakes that we made in terms of this social change. Lesson number 3, what we measure matters. I think of all the areas where we have made mistakes in the freedom movement, this is perhaps one of the ones where we make the most egregious mistakes. And perhaps maybe it's most visible in the actual education space. I find it rather ironic that the de facto measurement for education reform being successful or not successful, by and large, is the standardized test. Think about that for a minute. One of our foundational core principles as conservatives, libertarians, classical liberals, however we'd like to term it, is the critical importance of respecting the dignity of the individual. Is there any more collectivist form of measurement than standardized testing? I think this cartoon sums it up very well. For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Go ahead and climb that tree. This, for me, has a particular importance. My son is dyslexic and does very, very poorly on standardized testing. And yet, of all my 3 children, I think all of, even my daughter and some other son would agree, Joseph is the smartest. And yet that does not show up in a standardized test. It does not treat him as an individual. And as such, he came home, I remember, think about this as a parent. I remember him coming home in 3rd grade and saying, Dad, I'm stupid. And he believed that. That's what the system had built in for this young man who was extremely bright. But because the way in which we measured success, he deemed himself a failure. So as we think about in the freedom movement, what are the ways that we can perhaps better measure our reforms in freedom terms, not totalitarian collectivist terms? For education, it could be, how do individuals, measuring how engaged are they as citizens? Employment rates, right? The ability to secure employment and the kind of employment that they want. Are they prepared for that? I think there's, measuring learning attitudes, right? There's been studies done that once people leave college, they don't read another book. Well, why is that? Shouldn't education, the actual pursuit of education, be to fan the flames of learning and curiosity? It makes for better employers, it makes for better citizens, and it makes for a better country. So why aren't we measuring curiosity instead of standardized testing? My son knows everything about cars. Why? Because he's curious about it. He can tell me everything. He's curious. He learns on his own. So let's measure freedom in those terms. Along with this goes hand in hand, but definitions matter. And this goes a little bit back to the measurement thing. If we're defining success in terms of authoritarianism, we're never going to win with what we do. So along with measurement, define the terms. So a little bit of an add-on there. Lesson number 4. This goes a little bit with COVID. My little, you can't get away from a presentation this year without referring back to COVID. So here's my COVID hat tip. In order for change to occur, you need to find your super spreaders. you need to find change agents, people who can carry your message, not you, because at a certain point, once you get beyond some of those early adopters, it's not you that carries the message forward. The early adopters and people in that early adopter category are the ones you need out in front of the parade, not you anymore. Part of that is, a little bit of this. Who do the early majority, the late majority see in the mirror? Frankly, as innovators, libertarians, even in the US, if you look at the Libertarian Party, they're seen as weird. And as such, they deem the ideas as weird, even though the ideas actually will bring the most freedom. So if somebody can't see themselves in you or in your idea or in the face of your movement, they will not connect with your ideas. So for us in the freedom movement, the learning, the idea, the concept is, as we begin to espouse some of these ideas, and I think several groups in the US are actually starting to do a really good job of this with occupational licensing. They're taking themselves out of the story, and they're making the story about the African-American woman who lost her job hair braiding because of regulatory stuff. And she had put her out of business and put her back on welfare. So she becomes the super spreader in her community. And it's less about the think tank and the policy expert in Tennessee where this woman lives. And it's more about this woman and her fight for freedom. She becomes the super spreader, not me at Atlas Network. So how can we find people, if there's different audiences that we want to talk to and need to be influential in, we need to find that influencer who can connect with them and who the larger audience can see in themselves. When they look in the mirror, hey, yeah, I like that guy, I connect, he's like me. If they can't see that, you've got the wrong person leading out. So who are your super spreaders? If I think back to that effort in Utah, we got clobbered on the super spreader front. Why? Now, we complain about teachers' unions, and yes, they're an issue. But it's not so much the unions as it was teachers. So the teachers' union, really their benefit is they had built-in 50,000 super spreaders who could go out. They were in their communities. They were involved and engaged. And in fact, in Utah, the dominant religion is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, sometimes referred to as the Mormons. And because of that, because that was the dominant faith, guess what most of the teachers were? They were members of that faith, which meant that on Sunday, not only did they see them in the classroom, they saw their neighbors on Sunday. They had this extra level of influence and could be a super spreader when it came to the idea of defeating the vouchers. So for us, in the same token, who are our 50,000 super spreaders? We may not need that many, but we do need some. And they need to be connected to the key audiences that we need to influence. Lesson number 5. How do you accelerate or inhibit your social change? And we'll end here. Here are the 5 things you need to keep in mind as you're looking to move your social change forward, your policy idea, whatever it might be. So number 1, is it trialable? Can I do a trial, a sample? The early adopters, one of the key aspects of really getting them engaged and on board is they do need to see it working. It has to be a bit more than just a philosophical argument. In Utah, we actually did this, so we got a check mark here. We ran a small voucher program. There were some donors who put together a voucher scholarship fund in Utah and began running it for three or four years before trying to pass the universal voucher to create evidence. So look, there's demand. These Hispanic communities, these, the disability, those with disabilities, dyslexia, et cetera, they want this extra option. They're taking, we don't have enough scholarships to give them. And guess what? They're taking them, they're going to good schools, and they're doing really well. So we actually created this in Utah. It was a check mark for us. The next one is relative advantage. So how much better does life get by adopting your idea? And can I see a clear tie between that? In Utah, we got a big minus here because schools in Utah in general were good. Were they amazing? No, but there wasn't a real, oh my gosh, we really have to change that. There wasn't a significant relative advantage of going to that. In fact, in some cases, people were worried what would happen, especially in rural areas, if all of a sudden choice were introduced and what would happen to this school where there was part of their community. They would disrupt that. And that was a negative advantage as opposed to a positive relative advantage. Is it compatible? This one really gets into the attitudes and beliefs of a society. And I don't know that we spend enough time connecting into that well before we try to advance policy. I think we've been good at advancing policy and ideas. I think we need to spend a little bit more time in understanding, why do people resonate with socialism? What is it about that connects with them? We can laugh at it and say it's idiotic, it's stupid, but we do a lot of stupid things that we know aren't good for us either, even though we know the data doesn't align with that. I know, having a double bacon cheeseburger is not good for my cholesterol level, but I'm going to eat it anyway. Why? Well, because there's other reasons. There's other things where that's compatible with my values and beliefs. So how can we connect into that system, that value belief system, and show how freedom is more compatible with what they believe in socialism? If we can't understand that and connect with that and sympathize with that, we will never see long-term sustained change in the freedom movement. Complexity. This is where we had a minus for us again in the voucher thing. It was too complex too quickly. And then finally, observability. And again, this goes back to, again, in Utah, we had a small trial, but again, only 4% of the student population in Utah was not in public schools. So 96% could not observe or see what it would actually really look like to not have that system in place. Simply did not exist. So a minus for there. So if you can go through this list and identify each of these, put check marks next to them, you definitely accelerate your ability. If they can, if it's not as complex, if it's more observable, if there's an advantage that you can clearly communicate, if it resonates with their values, and if you can see a trial of where it may have worked, you are well on your way to accelerating the adoption of that. So we've run through a bunch of lessons. Let me just end on this. I know there are storm clouds on the horizon. Just listen to a fellow from Hong Kong who's basically said, he believes that Hong Kong is gone. China is going to absorb that. In the US, you had major socialist candidates. There are storm clouds on the horizon. And yet, I remain extremely optimistic. Part of that is the work that I'm seeing beginning to take hold as we're doing better at this in the US and at Atlas Network, in resonating with a broader set of audiences. Even in the election results, we are seeing there are some things on the horizon that give me hope that there's an opportunity here. Yes, we maybe have taken a few steps backwards, but I think as we get better in understanding how to create social change, I believe our message does not come with the Surgeon General's warning. We don't need to warn people about the ill effects of freedom because we are in the right. And so our job now becomes, how can we take that right and put the right might behind it? And in so doing, create the kinds of sustained wins and change that will allow freedom and human dignity and progress to flourish in the future. Thank you for having me. And I look forward to any questions if there are any. If not, Troy, thanks for having me here. It's been a pleasure.
Lyall, a fantastic way to start the event. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, if you like that kind of content,